I was thinking about how the Z2 Extreme, we're finally getting more data, more numbers about how this thing is performing in comparison to a lot of other processors we have, especially one that it is the most similar to, that being the HX370. We have some more data being able to actually directly compare these two processors, and I'll be honest, it's a little disappointing, but it has a very clear reason why in some cases the HX370 is still faster, and not even by like a small margin. And that all boils down to the fact that two reasons. The HX370 will have just generally more access to higher power draws, in excess of 50 plus watts, while most of the time the Z2 Extreme is going to be confined to a form factor that is, let's say, not very conducive to high wattage gameplay, while still maintaining its portability. There's also another compounding variable, that being the Z2 Extreme is actually 4 fewer cores than the HX370, and that was done for the sake of battery life and overall efficiency. They of course still have the same 890M integrated graphics, but those 4 fewer cores can contribute to the lower overall performance that some of us may or may not have been anticipating. I, for one, didn't think it would necessarily matter all that much. Where I was starting to get a little bit more concerned in terms of the value territory because of how good the Z1 Extreme was and how cheap we're seeing that still these days. In comparison to the Z2 Extreme, which devices using that chip will be probably starting at least at like $700, and then go always high in excess of maybe $1,000 depending on what SKU you get. So the value territory there isn't very good, and overall performance wasn't nearly the leap forward that I was expecting given how much you're going to be paying for it. So my question really was, would it even be worth it? ETA Prime put out an amazing video actually comparing the Z1 to the Z2. He did the whole thing, different power wattages, different games, different resolutions, and the results were, I would say, interesting, because it really, at least to me, validated the reason why the Z2 Extreme actually exists, and actually shows what AMD cares more about. And it actually makes a lot of sense, because if you looked at all those benchmarks and watched his video, which I highly recommend, I'll have it linked down below because I'll be referring to it quite a bit, you'll notice in some of the benchmarks that the Z2 and the Z1 Extreme perform fairly similarly. If you look at Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p at 25 watts, they're roughly within 4 FPS of each other, the Z1 Extreme being at 42 FPS, while the Z2 Extreme being at 46 FPS. Which that doesn't inherently seem all that bad, but once you drop it to 17 watts, the Z2 Extreme maintains just shy of 40 FPS at 39, while the Z1 is sitting at a lower 32. And I would argue that at 39 FPS feels way better than 32. When your FPS gets so low that every frame counts, which is what I would argue being under 60 generally is, that is going to go a long way in making that game feel significantly more playable, especially if you're utilizing something like FSR or a fluid motion frame generation. Every single frame goes a long way to improving overall smoothness. Dropping that to 900p, you go and sit at a comfortable 45 watts, which is pretty darn comfortable, especially if you're playing a single-player story-based game like Cyberpunk. And you get that at the 17 watts, which is what I find incredible. And I think a game that reflects this the most is Forza Horizon 5. It is an incredibly well-optimized game. Runs great on Z1 Extreme even at that 17 watt profile at a solid 60 plus FPS most of the time. And at 25 watts, you can get almost 80 at 76 averaged FPS. And same for the Z2 Extreme, you get a fairly high, at 25 watts, 80 FPS, which is fantastic. But dropping down to that 75 watt profile, you only lose 5 FPS at a 75 FPS frame average, which is amazing. If you remember just from a few moments ago, I said the Z1 Extreme at 17 watts maintained 62 FPS. That is 13 FPS fewer than the Z2 Extreme at 17 watts. And that extra 13 FPS goes a long way to making the game feel even smoother. Granted, it is still above 60 FPS for the Z1 Extreme, but it is one of the more extreme situations where you'll see such a large divide. There are still situations, though, where even at the same wattage, the gap between them is barely perceivable. At 25 watts in Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered at 1080p, you're getting 30 FPS on the Z1 Extreme and 31 FPS with the Z2 Extreme. I know I said every frame counts, but when it's only literally one in this context, the average gamer probably won't notice it at all. So it doesn't really go a long way in improving the overall experience. But something that's important to note is that with the Z2 Extreme barely being out, there hasn't been any driver development, any special optimizations that any developer might want to do. Because if you remember, even developers like Bethesda optimized for the RG Ally with the Z1 Extreme a little bit. I wouldn't say that it would go as far as to like, oh, this is a special version of the game that runs specifically on this hardware the best. But they did put in some effort to make the game run a little bit better on the Ally with the Z1 Extreme. So it's only natural that the Z2 Extreme should see that same level of support and overall driver development improving as the processor gets older, putting in some of that AMD fine wine optimization that happens. If you're not familiar, as an AMD processor or GPU gets older, it improves over time thanks to drivers, aging like fine wine, hence the name. It's essentially a fancy way of saying, sorry, our product kind of sucks at launch, but it'll get better with time, but with a little bit more pizzazz. It might sound a little bit harsh. Their processors and their fine wine methodology doesn't necessarily produce crappier processors at launch. It just means that if there are issues or if there are situations where they perform similarly to older same generation stuff like that, it will get better with time, and the gap will widen thanks to actual good driver development. It's not too dissimilar to how Intel has operated. Their stuff sucked a lot in the beginning, but if you bought that original A380 or something like that, it runs pretty good now. Sure, there still might be edge cases with it where it might not run this DirectX 9 game properly, but for the vast majority of people, it's gonna be just fine. So out of all the games that we've talked about, sure, there was one exception where it wasn't that good of a sort of result, but there are extreme cases where in the best situation, like in Forza, you're getting real generational improvement at lower wattages, which is the approach AMD is taking. So, to answer the question, is the Z2 Extreme even worth it? I would say it is worth it only if you care the most about battery life and you're constantly, or you find yourself in a situation where you're always mobile and you need the most and the endurance possible from your gaming handheld. But if you're the kind of person who plays their handheld mostly at home or in a hotel, or you find yourself near a constant power source, I would argue that you're probably fine with the Z1 Extreme. Just now turn the wattage up to the max you can all the time, and boom, you got a Z2 Extreme. That is a gross oversimplification, but it really depends on what you value most with your PC handheld. Do you care about performance the most, endurance, or a really good value? I always sit in the camp of what's the best value. And once Z2 Extreme handhelds are more widely available, I anticipate older Z1 Extreme based handhelds to see a pretty decent drop in price. People are already messaging me and mentioning in the comments that they've been able to get their RG Allies or the Legion Go's with Z1 Extremes at $400, $300. There was one person who mentioned that they were able to get their ROG Ally for like $250 with the Z1 Extreme, which all the caveats that handheld may come with a wonkier, more damage-prone micro SD card slot, but not easily as upgradable, not necessarily a downside when you're only spending $250. Those compromises are way more acceptable at an incredibly low price. And that's not the standard, and very much most people probably won't be able to get their hands on one at that price point. But you will eventually be able to find them at lower prices sooner rather than later. So while the Z2 Extreme is an amazing piece of technology, and is the perfect upgrade for certain people, I think the Z1 Extreme still will provide a pretty decent value going forward. And as for the Z2 Extreme, I would go as far to say that it is worth it, but it really depends on your use case. So I would actually think it's pretty good. I would love to hear what you guys think about this down below. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, all the social media garbage down below. And if anything in this video caught your attention, or if you have any thoughts, share them down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.